Hey everyone, you are listening to the third episode in the ClassofHC 2016 Election Clapback podcast series. It's a series that was inspired by a good book that I read this summer, and also a series that was provoked by a lot of the foolishness that we have all seen in this year's presidential election campaign in the U.S. I am Day G, the host of the Class of Hope and Change podcast. You can find out more information about that project at ClassofHC.com. Previously on the Election Clapback podcast, we talked about the free market and corporations and some of the history about how we ended up with capitalism as our economic system. That was episode 1. In episode 2, we talked about corporations and a little bit about the history of big business in America. This episode, number 3, is being recorded on Labor Day, so I figured it was only right to talk about a little bit about the history of working people in this country and how things like weekends and 9 to 5 and Labor Day itself came to be something that is almost I don't know if we take it for granted, but something that's an integral part, basic part of life in America today. So for background, for those who are listening to this podcast series for the first time, thanks for checking it out. For those who have been rocking since episode 1, appreciate each and every single one of you. For those who are new, this was a series, like I said, that was inspired by a really good book that I read this past summer. That was called Economix, Economix. If you want to check that out, it's by Michael Goodwin and Dan Burr. Basically, it's a comic book-like version of American history that's focused on our economy, our economic history, and how we kind of got to the place we are now. So if you're interested in checking that out, go ahead and take a look at that. But that was kind of the inspiration for this particular podcast series. Today, we're focused on workers and some of the history of workers in this country. We pick up in the book in the years after the Civil War. Big businesses were just starting to merge with other big businesses, and they're starting to buy out smaller businesses and put smaller businesses out of business in a lot of different industries, whether it was farming or tobacco or steel or oil or manufacturing. And also at the same time after the Civil War, you have the Industrial Revolution, steam engine, factories, all sorts of different types of technology and equipment that were completely changing the way most Americans lived. Until then, most people still lived on farms and grew food for a living. But now you're starting to see a move from farms away to more people living in urban areas and working in factories and that kind of thing. So at the same time as all those other things are happening, you also have a lot of immigrants coming from various different countries, and they were looking for a job, looking for a better life. And so you had a situation, and see if this sounds familiar, where it was like there were more workers than there were jobs. And so employers and businesses didn't really have to listen to stuff their employees complained about, whether it was little pay, low pay, whether it was the working conditions or the working hours that they were being forced to work, because at the end of the day, they knew that there were always a whole bunch of new people coming to this country and moving to a city who'd be more than happy, who for them that, that job that a worker was complaining about was a come up. And so they would be happy to take that job. And so that put employers and businesses in a powerful bargaining position. Just to give you a sense of some of the things that were going on at the time, and the book kind of illustrates this really well, but like as I've been going through this podcast series I'm mentioning, I'm only picking up on kind of the highlights, trying to do this little thing in short segments just to give you a taste of what's out there and hopefully spark a conversation for our current election campaign season. The book talks about kind of what life was like for workers around the turn of the century, 1890s, 1880s, coming into 1900s, 1910s. So just to give you a sense of it, if you were working in like a steel plant, you might have a 12-hour shift. So 10, I don't know what the times are, whatever, 12-hour shift, and then 7 days a week. So we're talking 12 hours, 7 days a week. You do the math on how many hours a week that is compared to how many hours a week you work now. Also at the time, you had private armies sometimes that would be hired. So if a whole bunch of workers got together and were like, hey man, look, this is messed up. Do you think it's messed up? Yeah, I think it's messed up. We need to come together. Let's go talk to the boss together. So if they figured out that workers started to do that, sometimes private armies would be sent in. Sometimes like actual government armies and soldiers would be sent in to physically harm those and kind of break that situation up. People who were trying to fight for better working conditions were often met with violence. You also had, especially in northern American cities, situations where the workers who paid to live in tenements, as they called them, particularly in places like New York City, but small sort of apartment buildings, see if this sounds familiar, where they're paying high rents and the landlords had money. The people were paying more than enough money to take care of the building, but the landlords, for whatever reason, we'll assume it's greed, but who knows what other reasons could have been, they were not taking care of the building. So people were living in these slums, very, very nasty and dirty and just sort of basically like inhumane, we would think of today, living situations, and they were paying for it, right? So that was some of the stuff that was going on. Also at the time, you had factories where women and girls were working, what we would call, underage in terms of child labor laws. As part of the time, they weren't really in existence then. So you could be a little kid working and you could be in a factory working, they could lock the doors on you. And there was a famous situation in 1911 by the name of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire, where 146 people died because they locked the doors. A fire started. Of course, the doors are locked, so the only option you have is, either dying or jumping out the window, which terrible, frightening option. So all this happened because they weren't really like building regulations. There weren't a lot of rules. Again, employers had more than enough people to pick from to work. So if someone got out of line and started running off at the mouth too much, they'll just fire them and hire somebody else. So you had all this stuff, just trying to give people a sense of what was going on. Meat packers, you had a situation where those who were producing meat at the time were not being clean with their stuff. And oftentimes you had vermin and all types of other uncleanliness in the meat that was getting shipped to U.S. grocery stores and, stores all across the country. And so there was no government agency at the time that was regulating like what people put in meat. So people just did whatever was the cheapest, easiest way to, make the stuff make a dollar at the same time. And so those were some of the things going on at the time. For those who are new to the Election Clapback series, part of the purpose of me creating this was to try to find a space where we could talk as citizens of this country and figure out actual solutions and find out where things are working and where people are actually implementing things that are improving their lives, and get away from a world where we just react to the silliness on our television screens day in and day out. And in order to do that, you have to know what's going on. And that's part of even today, what is always the tension is people end up arguing and going back and forth. They don't often even know what the issues are, really understand them in depth, because they haven't been told, and they don't even know what other alternatives exist. So we end up just arguing over things that we don't even necessarily need to be arguing about. In that moment of the late 1800s, early 1900s, there are reporters and people who were activists and things like that doing the work of educating the American people as to what was going on with their meat, what was going on in factories, what was going on in housing. And I just want to call out a few names. Jacob Riis, who was a journalist in New York City working around issues of housing and getting the word out about the terrible situations that workers had to live in terms of what they were paying for to their landlords. Upton Sinclair, who was an author and a journalist who talked about the food processing situation in America at that time and what it was actually like to produce America's meat and what went into that and what the factories were like and what the situations were. At that time, Americans had no idea. So these were the people that were sort of documentarians. Today, we think about a documentary on Netflix or something. These were people doing that work at the time. Ida B. Wells doing work around lynching and calling out and documenting the violence that was taking place all across the country, particularly in the South, but even in northern areas against Black American citizens. So people were documenting this work and saying things and letting the American people know about things that otherwise they wouldn't have heard. And so in this election clapback moment, it becomes important to talk about where we get our information from and what things we're actually even aware of or not aware of in this country. So you have all this stuff going on. 1900 comes, that election elects Teddy Roosevelt. He's the first president of the 20th century, and he passed a bunch of laws that were trying to help to deal with like all these different things that were happening in the country at the same time. So he passed some laws that broke up some of the businesses that were getting super, super big, and they were just too hard to control, and you couldn't tell them anything, and they were kind of just reckless in the country. And so he passed some laws that not only broke them up, but made it harder for businesses to merge together so that they could get that big again. He also protected public lands from industry development. So the national park system that we have in this country is largely attributed to Teddy Roosevelt as well, protecting spaces in America for nature and not allowing us to just build everywhere recklessly as ever we wanted to. And also Teddy Roosevelt passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is where we get our Food and Drug Administration from today. And so things like, that meat should be clean and all the things that we sort of think of as basic, again, as things that are relatively recent. I'm talking like 100 years, which is not a lot in human history. So Teddy Roosevelt is the person who was the president at the time when those things were happening. Woodrow Wilson came after him, also passed some other laws that made it harder for businesses to merge and to become like super corporations that were out of control and hard to regulate. So you had all those things happening, and I just wanted to always bring it back. You know, some of that was about the presidents. We always just want to come back to the people. Elections matter, and not every president is necessarily on board with everything that people are trying to do. But if the people's movement is enough, a president can still end up doing the thing that's best for the public. And so a perfect example of that was the holiday of Labor Day itself. So 122 years ago, back in 1894, is when the law got passed. Grover Cleveland was the president at the time, and he wasn't even in support of unions and bargaining, employees bargaining for better wages and better working conditions. But he signed the law because of the political fallout from a year before that, 1893, when he sent actual U.S. soldiers to Chicago to stop a strike. So a group of railroad workers working for a company called the Pullman Company were on strike and protesting some stuff that was going on at their job. The president of the United States sent troops to stop that, right, on behalf of a company. So that, again, gives you a sense of the kind of situation that was going on. 34 workers ended up losing their lives in that conflict. And so clearly people were not happy. And as a result, part of his damage control was a year later recognizing this holiday that many of the unions and working people had been already trying to get recognized for a while before that. And I really liked a quote from one of the founders of one of the oldest unions in the country called the American Federation of Labor, AFL. You guys probably have heard of it. And he says, I'm just going to read, his name is Samuel Gompers. He was founder of this organization, one of these unions. And he talked about Labor Day and said, Labor Day differs in every essential way from the other holidays of the year in any country. All other holidays are in a more or less degree connected with conflicts and battles of man's prowess over man, of strife and discord for greed and power, of glories achieved by one nation over another. Labor Day is devoted to no man, living or dead, to no sect, race, or nation. Which is kind of an interesting way to think about Labor Day. It really is something that is about as close to a general human holiday, maybe with the exception of not even New Year's. I guess New Year's is about one particular person's calendar, but it really is kind of an interesting thought that there would be a holiday that's just devoted to people who work, and that's the only condition for participating. And so that's kind of a useful thought. And as we kind of close here, just want you all to think about, you know, how history repeats itself. Probably as we were telling this story, definitely as I was reading this book, Economix, you just keep seeing like so many parallel issues. So for many people today, right, it seems like there's more people looking for a job than there are jobs to be had. In many areas, you have big businesses that are merging again with each other and creating situations where you have these industries in the 20s, they called them, in 1910s and around Teddy Roosevelt's time rather, they called them trusts. But that's the same thing. You just have like a few people running like a whole industry. Last episode, in episode 2, we talked about a bunch of industries that are becoming like that, where only a few people control like the whole thing. And so that limits your ability or my ability to start a new company and try something new, or at least just to get employed and get paid from providing a service if only a few people control it. And they're able to go to the federal government and state government and say, hey, pass this law so basically no one else can compete with us. So you have that situation going on. That was going on back then around the time of the unions too, at the early 20th century. So there are also fewer people in unions now. 50 years ago, there's around almost half the American working population was in union. Now we're down to somewhere around 10-15%. So people who like that, people who tend to advocate for business, big business, say that, hey, now the business can get back to focusing on what its main job is, which is to make money for shareholders. We talked about that last time, understanding what a corporation is and how that functions. People who don't like unions say, great, there should be no unions. Let businesses do what their job is, which is to make money. Workers, people who generally usually breaks down kind of on which side you end up on. If you see yourself more as an owner, an investor, and if that's how you make your money and that's sort of the lane you identify with, then you tend to see things the way I just said it. And if you are more like a worker and you just are an employee, you may own some 401k stock or whatever, but you're not some big time investor, and you're not the manager or owner of your own corporation, then you tend to see things differently, which would be that if you work for a company and it was people's labor or intelligence or effort that helped produce all this money, then people who produce that should be sharing in the wealth that comes out of that. And they shouldn't have to beg and plead just to be a part of what they help to create. So that's part of obviously an ongoing discussion. The other thing complicating that, the next chapter of the technological revolution, right, is that you have machines, equipment, technology, always advancing. You have outsourcing, which has been taking place for many, many years right now. And so you have a situation where just about all jobs can now be done many different parts of the world for dramatically cheaper. So before you should just be like, oh, well, we'll build a car or build a refrigerator somewhere else. You can get your taxes done in another country. You can get legal research done. You can get x-rays examined. So there's all sorts of people, white collar, college educated, degrees, whatever, whose work can be done by someone in another nation for much, much less. And so there are a lot of people now who are in a situation where, you know, businesses are getting close to the point where, like, we don't even have to argue with you anymore. We'll just go pay someone else in a different country to do your job, and that'll be the end of that discussion. So that's also kind of the situation we're in right now. And so we have to decide as a country, what do we do about that? How do we figure out what America looks like in this next chapter? We also have a housing issue here, particularly in large cities where global wealth is coming and people from different countries are buying up property. And in some ways, they're competing in the same market for housing that working people are competing, just trying to find a place to live. So it may not be the same situation as tenements and slumlords, although obviously there are definitely slums in every city in this country, but there's still a housing problem 100 years later, right? And reporting still matters. You know, part of the reason for this podcast was because I read this really good book, and it was a New York Times bestseller. It's been out for 4 years, and I'd never heard of it until I happened to walk by it in a bookstore. And it's the kind of thing that I feel like should have been all over the news. It should have been in every person's hand. I used to teach high school. I would have put it in every high schooler's hand that I knew at the time. I still might just go do that. If you want to fundraise, reach out to me at ClassofHC@gmail.com. We'll see if we can't buy a whole bunch of copies, start distributing it to high schoolers. You know, that kind of thing is important. So reporting matters, documentaries matter. And so I'll just share with you a few of the places I go to for like really, really good reporting, because there's things that are happening in this country, both good and bad, that you'd never hear about from watching your favorite cable news channel. I don't care what situation you are in terms of where you fall politically. There's stuff that goes on in this country that you could watch your favorite news channel from sun up to sundown. You'd have no clue about. And so it's important that someone else is doing some longer term reporting that's just bigger than 6 minutes news segments and cut to a commercial break. I personally like ProPublica, which is an excellent investigative journalism outfit. I also like Democracy Now! I also like C-SPAN. You guys may have some others. Definitely reach out to me and let me know. Always looking forward to expanding my knowledge base and where we can get information from. So at ClassofHC is the handle on all social media if you want to reach out to us. So the final election clapback question for us is, what should everyday workers do today, right now, 2 months before this presidential election? What are people doing to improve their situation as it relates to work and their work conditions? And what should we be doing going forward, regardless of what happens with our elections? And what should we be asking, demanding from these people who come to us asking for our votes? So that was this election clapback episode. Next time, we're going to be talking about when America was great, at least if you were European and male. Reach out to us at ClassofHC on social media. If you're reaching out on Twitter, please use, or actually any social media, please use the hashtag Election Clapback so that we can follow your comment and see that and respond to it. We're also at ClassofHC@gmail.com if you want to reach out to us. Appreciate each and every single one of you for listening. Have a great one.